It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, the man has spoken, the guy that some people call the Sphinx of Washington. 74-year-old Robert Mueller appeared before the cameras yesterday. Everybody's been wanting to talk to this guy, or hear from him anyway, for over 2 years. And there he was in the floodlights talking about his report. And I thought, God, I got to get the doc back on the line. Dr. Stephen Schmidt, our political analyst up at Iowa State University, and see what he thinks of this, because it was kind of revealing on some levels and maybe not so much on the other. And as regular listeners to the show know, Dr. Schmidt is, well, they call him Dr. Politics up there. He's the Lucan Professor of Politics. He literally wrote the textbook, American Government and Politics Today, used by millions of political science students around the globe. And he's a frequent visitor on these call-in and talk shows and blogs and newspaper articles, and we're just tickled to death to be able to get him on what I call the Podcast by George live line on this Saturday morning. How you doing up there, Doc?
I'm great, and thank you for inviting me again.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on here. And just to get into this Mueller thing a little bit, my initial reaction of it was, and he kind of, this was the point, really. There's nothing new here. It's in the written report that everybody's been dissecting. I thought one of the more interesting things to maybe analyze or look at was the timing of his appearance and maybe the reason for it. What did you take away from that little TV presser that he did?
Well, number one, there was a comedian by the name of Professor Irlen Quarry, Corey, and your podcast listeners should go to Google and watch an episode of Irlen Quarry, because Irlen Quarry was this crazy professor who would get on these TV late night talk shows and stuff, and he would start talking, and then he would suddenly go left, and then he'd go right, and you had no idea where the hell he was going. And I think Robert Mueller has done the same thing in both his 4,000-page report, 400-page, what's the difference? Nobody will read the whole thing, and on his press conference, which is, well, what is it? Is Trump and his campaign guilty of cooperating and getting the Russians and WikiLeaks to get him elected president or not? And, you know, he put it in such terms that the average person at the mall here or at one of the big box stores probably couldn't unravel it. And the pundits and the really smart people, you know, they know what he was saying. He was saying, well, you know, Trump is guilty and I couldn't do anything about it because there's some memo in the Justice Department that says that you can't indict a sitting president. I've never seen that memo. I've been looking for it. Where the hell is that memo? And who wrote it? Who signed it? I have no idea. Yeah. But that memo prevents someone like a special counsel or a special prosecutor from indicting a president. And Chuck Grassley, the senior senator from Iowa, said that, you know, if the president was guilty, then Mueller should have said so. The quote is, Mueller should have indicted Trump if he thought Trump did something wrong. And Grassley says after spending 2 years and $35 million and finding no collusion or no crime, it's about time to get off the federal payroll. Well, Mueller is getting off the federal payroll. You know, he's retiring. But he's left the country in a real pickle because, you know, people who support Trump said, see, you know, you couldn't indict him. There was nothing there. And so the whole Russian hacking thing and so on and collusion and was really fake news and a conspiracy by the Democrats. And the Democrats are saying, you see, what Mueller said proves that we should go ahead and impeach him, because he kind of said, well, I can't do anything about it. The legal system can't do anything about what we discovered. But there are other places, and, again, circumspect, other places where this could be continued. And the interpretation, so-called reading between the lines, is that it's Congress and impeachment. Well, you should never, in a critical thing like this, force people to read between the lines. And Robert S. Mueller III, I think, has failed, frankly. He's failed the country. He will go down in history as this cautious bureaucrat, carefully doing this and that, and disciplined, quiet, and by the book, as the New York Times, quoting the New York Times here, conducted his investigation and then gave this report that, again, leaves it just as difficult to understand where we should go as the report or the 4-page summary by Attorney General Barr. I mean, why don't these people just come out and say what the truth is on all of this? Anyway, that's my rant on it.
No, I agree. I mean, I'm watching this guy and I'm thinking, well, hopefully here, because when he went in there, it was to get rid of the opinion part of it. People had,
Right.
two sets of opinions on this thing, and he hasn't done anything to resolve that. People are still holding dear to those two sets of opinions, and I'm trying to read between the lines, and I'm thinking, okay, now is this a 74-year-old man that's given his life to public service? I think he was a war hero. I think he's a guy that's got a great military background. He was a 12-year veteran of the FBI. By the way, I pointed out on this show and to everybody else, he got that WMD thing wrong, and don't ever forget that, people that listen to me, because they know how important that is to me.
Right.
But he did this for 2 years. And
Right.
so is he coming out on television to say, look, I'm 74, I'm heading to the farm. I've done my bit, it's in the report, it's all in writing, I'm done. Or, now that's one opinion, one way to look at it, is he saying, look, guys, I laid out all of this obstruction justice stuff to you that I can't do anything about, but you can, Congress, House of Representatives, get after it. Is it one or the other, or a little bit of both, do you think?
Both. It's both. It's both. He's done. He is headed for the farm, or whatever. And at the same time, someone who is kind of wrapping up their distinguished public service career and career in the military should have enough courage. I'll use the word courage to sacrifice a little bit of, the criticism he would get and say it like it is, instead of using this bureaucratic legalese mumbo jumbo and kind of obtuse references to summarize things, which even the experts disagree on what he said. And President Trump says one thing and his supporters say, see, it's done with, it's over with, there is no indictment. We can't prove that Trump did anything wrong or his campaign did anything wrong, and let's move on. Or the other side says the opposite. Aha, here we are, So I think the Democrats, I feel sorry for the Democrats, because they're kind of left now with the question, what do we do now? And the pressure seems to be, frankly, to move ahead with the startup of impeachment, which is basically to bring in people under oath, to grill them and ask them questions. And I think that's what the Democrats are going to do. They're going to start, I think, the impeachment process. More and more Democratic presidential contenders are saying we need to move in that direction. And I think Nancy Pelosi, just like the dam in Davenport, which held for a while as the Mississippi rose, I think those levees of hers are going to break, and she's going to go, okay, we got to swim now, and let's go ahead. On the other hand, there's so much other stuff going on that the American public, which has never gotten clear-cut smoking gun evidence of all this, although the seven intelligence agencies have said, the Russians were interfering here. The public still is skeptical, and it just drags us on and on, while there are, lots of other things that could require public attention. The public only has so much attention span for these types of issues. And you can't have them paying attention to the Mueller probe and to collusion and all that, and at the same time pay attention to national disasters and flooding and immigration issue and the European Union falling apart, and an election coming up in the United States, which will be one of the most important elections in American history. You can't expect them to pay attention to all that. So it's a tough time for us.
Here's one thing I will say. I kind of took away from watching Mueller, and I'm always struck by this because I came out of the School of Broadcasting, and I was in radio. And I always tell people, you can have an event that requires media, and you can have the New York Times there with a notepad. You can have NPR there for radio with a microphone, and you can have a Mason City television station and have people gathering around, and they will flock to get their faces in the lens of the Mason City television station. Television, the power of TV cannot be underestimated. So I'm watching Mueller yesterday, and I'm thinking to myself, and here we are, Doc, we're talking about it today, and everybody is, as an example, because Mueller appeared on television. Now, if the Democrats pursue these impeachment proceedings, their hope or their desire, their wish should be that it'll be like Watergate, which you and I are old enough to remember. That was on television every day. That had as much, if not more, to do with the facts of the impeachment proceedings as anything to getting Nixon out of office. It was on TV. And Mueller's appearance yesterday couldn't underline that more. The secret military-industrial complex, if you want to call it that, but also the impact of media in our society cannot be underestimated. And I was really struck by that yesterday.
And can I add something? You're right, but can I add that the power of radio is no less than TV? And I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
The summer of the Watergate hearings, I had a family membership at a motel in Ames, a Ramada Inn, which had a beautiful swimming pool and a restaurant and a bar that would serve you there. And my kids spent the summer there every day that the weather was nice, swimming and stuff. I spent time with one of my great friends and colleagues, Jerry Dorfman, and his family, and we listened to the Watergate hearings on radio.
Oh.
And we were glued to that radio, and it was fascinating to hear the testimony of all those crazy actors and players and weird things, and the Cubans and, the Mexican money payoffs and all this. So, yes, the media is incredibly important. Television, cable, but also radio. And what we're doing here is there are no visuals. People are not seeing you or myself.
Yeah.
But they are glued to their laptops or smartphones and listening to what we're talking about. And so that is what makes a democracy, I think, viable, is that people have access to this information.
You mentioned Nancy Pelosi. Now, in addition to her responsibilities as the head of the Democrats in the Congress, she's a political tactician, too. She has to be. Do you think she's wanting to see whether or not it looks like, and we'll know here very shortly, really, maybe some people kind of already have a feel for it, but Trump can be gotten out of office via the electoral process, which is only, one short year and a half away. Does she want to kind of wait and see if it looks that way? If it does, leave the impeachment thing alone. The goal here is to get rid of him. and
Well,
maybe flip some seats in the Congress, and let's just do it with the election because this is rolling our way, and not take a chance on the impeachment proceedings.
That's exactly a great summary of what Nancy Pelosi thinks is the smartest political way of handling this, because she's looking at what happened to Bill Clinton when the Republicans went after him with impeachment, and he got reelected. He left office after 2 terms with incredibly high approval ratings. And so she is saying, if you can do impeachment and get the Senate to convict and remove a president, that's one thing. But to just have the impeachment hearings, the only way that it might work is if there is a real hardcore smoking gun, the way there was with Richard Nixon and Watergate. And Richard Nixon looked at all this and said, it's not just the House that is charging me with these things, but the Senate is going to vote to actually convict me. And so I'm quitting, I'm leaving. That's not the case right now. The Senate is not, I'm certain, is not going to bite on that. And if the House starts impeachment hearings, the Senate is not going to go ahead and convict them, even if there is a lot of evidence that there was collusion. So Nancy Pelosi is thinking, let's let New York State, continue with their investigations, and they're going to try to release some of President Trump's New York tax returns, which I think Trump is very worried about, and which may show, Pelosi thinks it's going to show some, surprising stuff, like Trump really didn't make very much money. Number 2, Trump didn't pay any taxes. Number 3, Trump had income from very weird places that people should be worried about, and that will kind of undermine his credibility. And so I think she's wanting to go that direction. But the party is moving more and more in the direction of starting impeachment investigations, at least. So we'll just have to wait and see what direction this all goes. But it's I think a painful time for Americans and for American society, because every other country in the world is looking at all this and they're saying, wow, our political system isn't so bad. Look at what the Americans are going through.
Embarrassing. Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that parallel with Clinton, because here's the angle that, and I look at it exactly that way, in a little slightly different twist. The thing about Clinton was, he got impeached, but the voters of America looked at that in the end analysis running up to his reelection and the way that he's going to be treated with history. And they said, okay, that was good. You impeached him, but you impeached him for having oral sex in the White House. And that ain't that big of a deal. And it didn't come back to haunt him or the Democrats. They didn't lose seats in Congress during that election. I read about that. So that was with Clinton. With Trump, if they impeach him, his supporters and people that are likely, Trump voters out there will look at it and say, well, yeah, you impeached him like you did Bill Clinton, but you impeached him over obstructing justice on allegations of colluding with the Russians, which were actually disproven by Robert Mueller. So therefore, no harm, no foul. Nancy Pelosi, as you mentioned, hopes that the tax issue will come up and financial dealings like that. But those same likely Trump voters will look at that and say, Bill Clinton fooled around with his wife. We all do that. Taxes? Yeah. He probably cheated on his taxes, probably did some things he should. We as Americans, we all do that too. I'm going to vote for him again.
Oh, boy, I'll tell you, it's so discouraging. I heard, and I agree, that the supporters of Donald Trump are not ready to abandon him. And that's even true with the economic situation with the tariffs. I saw an interview this morning with a Pennsylvania trucking company owner who is losing a ton of money because of tariffs and because there's no new NAFTA and because his business is suffering with the trade with Mexico because it's a trucking company, and he says they've had a big decline in business, and he says it's really, really hurting him. And it was a great interview. They asked him, did you vote for Trump? He said yes. He went through all the discussion of kind of what he's doing, laying off people and other stuff. Then the reporter said, well, in the upcoming elections, are you going to vote for him again? And the guy said, absolutely yes. And that was kind of a surprise punchline there at the end, because you would think the answer was no, because you're losing so much money. But there are so many other, and then they interviewed a bunch of other people in that town in Pennsylvania, and Trump's approval rating is higher than it was when he got elected, and that town went 70% for Trump, and now people there approve of him even more. And so the Democrats have to be careful in making calculations about, well, all this stuff with Trump is going to really cost him the reelection. And I keep saying, and I've said it to you and your listeners, that a lot of the voters who voted for Trump don't trust the Democrats, didn't like Hillary Clinton, didn't trust Hillary Clinton in terms of policy. And in June, it's June of 2019, they still don't know where the Democratic Party is going to go, who's going to be the standard bearer in 2020, the presidential and vice presidential contenders. And so they're still going, well, I know Trump and I know what he's doing, and some stuff I don't like, but I don't care because the Democrats are not giving me anything that I feel more comfortable with. And so I'm sticking with Trump. And that's where we are.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it has to do with the fact that as long as somebody's at the top of the Republican ticket that maybe isn't any worse than Donald Trump, they're always going to support him because they're never going to vote Democratic, because they're never going to vote for someone they think might raise their taxes, might take away their guns, and might support abortion rights. Those are three things that the Republicans, regardless of who's at the top of their ticket, can't get by. They're not going to vote Democratic. They're going to vote for Trump or whoever is there, because they cannot vote the other way, and they will not, and that's always going to be there. The other thing about it is, and I love talking to you, and I love talking politics, and people would think that, I'm nuts about politics. Hopefully I'm not, because politics in this country, with the political parties, it's risen to almost like college football. These college football coaches, they get convicted of cheating in recruiting and, heinous crimes when it comes to their sport and the way that it operates and the fun. They don't care. They're Sooners. They're Nebraska supporters. They're going to support them regardless. Right. The other example would be religion, and it's risen to the level of religion almost. I mean, with the Catholic Church as an example. I mean, they find all these cardinals that are guilty of sexual molestation, all that type of thing. You ask these people, "Are you no longer going to be Catholic?" Well, they're Catholic. They're not changing religions, and Republicans aren't changing parties.
Not anymore. They kind of weeded it out, and the moderate Republicans. I had a good acquaintance. I think of him as a friend. God rest his soul. Art New, who was a moderate Republican, served as lieutenant governor, and he left the Republican Party, pretty much drifted away as the party moved further to the right. And so that has all taken place already. And if you're a Republican right now, you're okay with the Republican Party as it's working right now. And that's, the polarization that I lecture on this. I talk about it. I talk to community organizations and corporations, give keynote speeches and stuff. And It's called the politics of disruption, and it's all about the building polarization in the United States politically between conservatives and liberals, and especially Democrats and Republicans. And I think I've mentioned this before, but I'll repeat it because it's so amazing. Democrats and Republicans are dating less and less each other. They're sticking with people of the same party. Democrats and Republicans are not marrying each other as much anymore as they used to, and it's declining sharply. And Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and I have a great animated GIF, an animated graphic that shows over the past 25 years how Democratic and Republican members of Congress have stopped talking to each other, socializing with each other. They no longer interact with each other. They're in their own little corner and protecting their turf, and that's where we are in terms of the political system right now. And it's a tragedy because you can't get very much done because no party has an overwhelming dominance and majority. And as you can see, you got the president and you got the Senate, and then the House is the Democrats, and the same is true in state houses where you're divided, and one party may be in control, but it doesn't have a overwhelming majority in most cases. In a few cases, it does. It's in some places the Democrats really dominate the state politics, and other places the Republicans do. But this polarization makes it so hard to make decisions. I always tell people when I do a keynote speech somewhere, just think what would happen if your company or your organization was divided almost 50-50, and every time that you have a staff meeting or a planning meeting or a financial meeting, half of the group in the room says no and the other half says yes. I mean, how much would your company be able to get done? And the U.S. is like a company, and we're not getting a lot done.
Well, that's well said. Let me put a ribbon on this little segment. I want to finish here with this, just a couple of paragraphs here from the Associated Press. This appeared yesterday, and the Associated Press, to me, as a former news guy, they were right down the middle. I mean, I like AP's reporting by and large. Now, the wingnuts will tell you that Associated is another word for communist, but it's from the Associated Press, Dateline, Washington, D.C. President Donald Trump angrily assailed special counsel Robert Mueller's motives on Thursday. Now, that in itself bothers me. I don't want a guy running the country in charge of the nuclear codes, negotiating with our allies and enemies, flying off the handle as much as this guy does. I see his red face. I don't want a guy like that running my company. I don't want a guy like that living next door to me. It's just, that doesn't make me feel safe and good about him regardless of the issues.
Sure.
Now, that was a day after Mueller bluntly rebuffed Trump's repeated claims that the Russia investigation had cleared him of committing a federal crime of obstruction of justice. The president also offered mixed messages on Russia's efforts to help him defeat Democrat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election campaign. First, Trump tweeted that he had nothing to do with Russia helping me get elected. That was the first time he seemed to acknowledge that Russia worked to see him elected, something that was underscored in the Mueller's report. Well, then on the White House South Lawn, Trump told reporters, Russia did not help me get elected. You know who got me elected? You know who got me elected? I got me elected. Russia didn't help me at all. Trump insisted that he's been tough on Russia and that Moscow would have preferred Clinton as president. He's always talking about Hillary Clinton, my God. Well, that's not what Russian President Vladimir Putin had said. When asked last year in Helsinki whether he wanted Trump to become president, Putin replied, yeah, I did. Trump's 20-minute eruption. Now, I got to say, I didn't. Did you see any video from this, Doc? I mean, was he this?
Yeah.
Did that strike you?
He was pretty animated.
Was he?
Yeah, red-faced, animated, but nobody pays any attention to that anymore. and the tweets, a lot of people are not paying any attention even to the tweets, except the news media, which keeps propagating the tweets. But we've heard it all before. We know that Trump likes to go after his adversaries. He likes to call them names. And that's his method, essentially, of cutting down and diminishing his adversaries. And we have to get used to that. That's not going to change. And with Mueller, I don't know. I guess if I was Trump, I would have had a rant saying, you see, I told you, Mueller just said no collusion, no conspiracy, no nothing. Didn't you listen to his press conference when he gave it? He said, I can't convict the president, so that's it. Let's move on. Instead, he goes after Mueller. And one day he says the report was great and the special counsel exonerated him, and then an hour later he tweets that this is all fake news. So how confusing is that? But let me add something that we cannot forget, and that is that President Trump is very, very brilliant, essentially, at diverting attention and at keeping us off guard and keeping us jumping from one thing to the next, because as soon as this Mueller thing came out and people were saying, well, you see, Mueller said, I can't convict him because there's this memo that nobody's ever seen in the, in the Justice Department that says you can't indict a president, but, somebody else might be able to do it. As soon as that came out, what did he do? He imposed tariffs on all imports from Mexico, and the news media, who are the most attention deficit disordered organization in the country, they're like squirrels,
Yeah.
and he throws this Mexican tariff at us, and the news media rushes over there, and now you and I should be talking about the Mexican tariffs, because the Mueller thing is ancient history. Nobody cares anymore. Nobody is interested. It's too confusing, and the Democrats are having, as the Italians say, agita, which is agitation and palpitations over it. But the rest of the country, and in Iowa, I'm sure farmers are saying, man, we got tariffs on Chinese stuff, and now we're getting tariffs on Mexican imports, and Mexico is going to, I'm sure, retaliate. And Iowans, I used to do some workshops in Mexico with my colleague in the business college here, John Wong, professor of marketing, and we would go take a group of Iowa companies down to Monterrey, Mexico, and we would run a workshop getting Iowa companies hooked up with Mexican companies so that they could import services and products. And these were not farmers selling, grain or cattle. These were specialized Iowa companies, I remember one company that has a fabulous compressor system, and the Mexican buyers loved it, and they bought a bunch of these compressors that allow you to basically wipe graffiti off walls and clean concrete walls and stuff. And so we export a lot of great stuff to Mexico, and on top of the Chinese tariffs, and we send cattle too. We spent some time talking to cattle importers in Mexico who were very interested in basically negotiating with Iowa cattle farmers to import cattle on the hoof and then slaughter them in Mexico, which was more cost effective. But, if the tariffs go up with Mexico, we don't have a new trade agreement. Iowa farmers are going to get hit, and Iowa small companies that export to Mexico are going to get hit with another barrier to doing trade. And you think we'd be talking about that, and I'm really shocked that we're not talking more about that. Now, Grassley says, no tariffs. Tariffs are a bad thing. But he should go in, and he should lean over the desk of Donald Trump and stare him in the eyes and say, you stop passing all these tariffs, or I'm not going to support you anymore. And you'd better do it really quickly, because I've had it with this. But these guys are apparently not very brave. They're all afraid of President Trump for some reason. But these tariffs they're not a good idea. And my neighbors and friends that farm, and I have a lot of those because I live on a farm, they have kept saying to me when I talk to them socially, well, these tariffs are negotiating strategies by Trump to get the Chinese and the Europeans and the Canadians and now the Mexicans to be more fair in their trade. And there aren't going to be any tariffs. Well, guess what? There are tariffs. The Chinese are now striking back at us. The Mexicans are going to strike back at us. And, did you know the Great Depression started with tariffs?
I did not know that.
The Smoot-Hawley Act, which was an America First tariff act, basically choked off commerce and started a recession which ended up being the Great Depression. You don't want to mess with tariffs to the extent, I think, that we're messing with them now.
And it's going to be hard times for the heartland because not only do we have those tariffs, but they're coming to the realization now that many of these farmers, and I mean, a lot of farming is not going to get done in this state because excuse me, because of the flooding. They can't get into the fields, and it's going to be game over very shortly. You can plant beans late, but it's getting real late, folks, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And parts of southwestern Iowa are going underwater again. I mean, the rivers are rising out there again. It's just a terrible situation. Well, before we leave, you're talking about the politics of Donald Trump. In Washington, D.C. yesterday, there's a report that Trump said that well-meaning aides tried to shield him from view of a warship named for political foe John McCain during a recent visit to Japan, but that he had nothing to do with the effort. So, I don't know, Doc. I mean, I can read on with this, but you know what happened out there. It's like when you think it can't get any nuttier, it's like I read these stories and I call them "what in the hell" stories. What is this?
Well, Donald Trump still doesn't like the deceased Senator John McCain. They are both incredibly tough people and got into each other's hair. And I don't know if President Trump issued the order, if one of his staff people issued the order, but it's pretty clear that the United States Navy in Japan was told to shield the name John McCain on the ship that was there for repairs because it had been rammed by a tanker, I think. And they put a tarp over the name, and then they brought in, I think, a large tugboat because the tarp just seemed too obvious that they were covering the name, and they parked a big tub next to the ship to block the name McCain so that President Trump or the media, I think, it was more that the media would see it and then do a story on it. But it's just the kind of craziness that is going on politically now, and I don't know what Americans would find that to be acceptable or a good thing even. It's just a giant waste of time and effort, and you basically using the military politically, which I don't like at all. I spent some time in Colombia when General Rojas Pinilla took over the country and declared himself president and used the military to basically rule for a few years, and that didn't work out very well at all. And so using the military for partisan political stuff, I just am not a big fan of that.
It's like he's endeavoring to change the way humans, societies work in this world. There isn't anybody that agrees that you with condemning the dead, speaking poorly of the dead. I mean, that's very common stuff. I mean, I've got these friends, what I would consider to be centrist Democrats, that hate Donald Trump for these personal tics of his that may be an outgrowth of his background or in New York or whatever. But my God, this just pales. It's just terrible what he has to say about a dead guy that was a war hero in the United States John
Sure,
McCain. And I'm sorry. The only other thing I was going to say is the other part about his demeanor is going back to Teddy Roosevelt. Walk softly and carry a big stick. It's like he's trying to turn that upside down. That was kind of the way America operated. That's kind of
walk loudly and carry even bigger stick, I guess. But
yeah.
But the destroyer John S. McCain was named after John McCain's
father, wasn't it? Yeah.
Grandfather.
Oh, grandfather.
And
all right.
father and
Yeah.
father, who both served in the Navy. It was, in honor of Admiral John S. McCain Jr., who was a submarine commander in the Pacific. And so, give me a break.
Yeah, it's just too much. Well, we'll leave it there. We've run over time, but these are fascinating issues that we're dealing with today, and they just get, maybe stranger by the day. And we've been talking with Dr. Stephen Schmidt from his office up there at Iowa State University, and want to thank you again for being on the show, and thank everybody for listening in to another podcast by George.